Begin with breaking news out of the White House, where US President Donald Trump has signed tariffs on imports.
Where the self-imposed deadline set by President Trump to introduce trade tariffs.
For decades, the American auto industry has stood as a titan of global manufacturing, fueling economies, shaping innovation, and symbolizing industrial dominance. But all of that is changing fast. A storm is brewing, and at the center of it stands Mexico, delivering a counterstrike that no one saw coming. What was once a stable alliance is now a battlefield, with Mexico leveraging its strategic power to strike at the heart of American manufacturing. Factories are on the brink of collapse, supply chains are paralyzed, and automakers are scrambling to survive. But how did we get here? And more importantly, can the US auto industry survive the impending devastation? Strap in, this is a high-stakes economic war that could redefine global power. The strike that shook America. For decades, the United States auto industry stood as a symbol of economic strength, technological innovation, and industrial dominance. Brands like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler shaped the very identity of American manufacturing, producing cars that became icons of power and mobility. But overnight, that legacy was put in jeopardy. Mexico's counterstrike wasn't just a diplomatic response, it was an economic torpedo aimed straight at the heart of America's auto industry. The crisis didn't unfold slowly, it hit like a thunderclap. At first, whispers circulated among financial analysts that Mexico was considering an aggressive move, but no one expected it to happen so swiftly. Without warning, Mexico announced severe export restrictions on key materials and components that American automakers relied on. Overnight, essential shipments were blocked, production schedules were thrown into chaos, and supply chains collapsed. For the first time in modern history, the American auto industry was paralyzed, not by competition, not by a financial crisis, but by a foreign nation's deliberate counterattack. In the weeks leading up to the retaliation, tensions had been escalating. The US government had implemented a series of tariffs designed to protect domestic manufacturing and pressure Mexico into renegotiating trade agreements. But Mexico, instead of backing down, fired back with a move that no one had predicted, one that would throw the entire American auto industry into disarray. With surgical precision, they cut off the flow of crucial raw materials, essential components, and even halted logistics agreements that kept American factories running. The impact was immediate and brutal. Assembly lines ground to a halt, forcing thousands of factory workers into sudden unemployment. For years, US automakers had become dependent on Mexico for manufacturing partnerships, cheaper labor, and access to critical resources like steel, aluminum, lithium, and rare earth metals used in electric vehicle production. But now, those resources were locked behind a political wall, inaccessible to American manufacturers who had never prepared for such a scenario. Wall Street panicked. Stocks in major automakers plummeted as investors realized the full weight of Mexico's counterstrike. Within hours of the announcement, Ford lost billions in market valuation, General Motors faced a supply chain disaster, and Tesla, already struggling with global market competition, found itself unable to secure materials for its battery production. The economic impact rippled far beyond the auto industry, shaking steel manufacturers, dealerships, and even financial institutions with deep investments in the automotive sector. The question everyone was now asking was simple but terrifying: had Mexico just rewritten the rules of global trade warfare? For years, the US had operated with an unshakable confidence that its economic dominance was untouchable. But now, with Mexico's precise and devastating strike, it became clear that the balance of power was shifting. The American auto industry, once a global powerhouse, was now in uncharted territory, struggling to survive against an economic adversary that knew exactly where to hit. If Mexico could do this in a single strategic move, what else could they be capable of? Mexico's master plan, how did they pull this off? For years, Mexico had been one of the United States' most crucial trade partners, particularly in the auto industry. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and its successor, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, had created a deeply interconnected supply chain between the two nations. American automakers relied heavily on Mexico's factories for cheaper production costs, skilled labor, and raw materials that were essential for manufacturing vehicles. But in a shocking turn of events, Mexico turned this dependency into its greatest weapon. While the U.S. government had assumed that tariffs would push Mexico into submission, Mexico's economic strategists had been preparing for this moment long before the first American tax was imposed. Behind closed doors, they had spent months drafting a counterattack that would strike precisely where it hurt the most, America's auto industry, one of the largest contributors to its GDP. The retaliatory measures were not hastily assembled but were part of a long-term strategy to remind the world that Mexico held just as much power in this trade war as the United States did. The first stage of the counterattack involved cutting off exports of essential automotive components. Mexico didn't need to block finished cars, instead, they restricted the flow of crucial parts like transmissions, axles, and wiring harnesses, without which American cars couldn't even be built. Overnight, U.S. factories found themselves with half-assembled vehicles sitting useless on production lines, waiting for parts that were now stuck behind a political firewall. But that wasn't all. Mexico also shut down lithium exports, a devastating blow to the American electric vehicle (EV) industry. Lithium is a vital component for EV batteries, and while many assumed that China held the monopoly on lithium production, Mexico had quietly positioned itself as a major supplier. With this single move, Tesla, Ford, and General Motors found themselves scrambling to find alternative sources, a near impossible task in the short term. The second stage of Mexico's retaliation came in the form of logistical warfare. Mexico suspended key transportation agreements, blocking the smooth flow of goods across the border. Freight companies that had previously moved materials seamlessly between the two nations were suddenly hit with new bureaucratic hurdles, additional inspections, and longer wait times. What once took days now took weeks, further crippling the already fragile U.S. supply chain. And then came the final blow, a diplomatic maneuver that left Washington reeling. Mexico bypassed traditional trade negotiations and instead formed stronger economic ties with China and Europe, offering these nations access to its automotive industry in exchange for investments and trade agreements that directly competed with the United States. While American automakers struggled to deal with supply chain issues, Chinese automakers swooped in, expanding their market presence in Mexico and using the country as a production hub for exporting cars worldwide. This wasn't just economic retaliation, it was a full-scale geopolitical shift. Mexico was no longer simply reacting to U.S. policies, it was actively reshaping its own economic future, positioning itself as a global automotive powerhouse independent of American influence. With American automakers hemorrhaging money and production grinding to a halt, could the United States find a way to counter Mexico's bold move before it was too late?